And so if you can stimulate the production of goods and services, it's helpful. It's a little tougher to control the money supply, although I think it can be done, than just saying that you should control it, because we've had the growth of credit cards, which is a form of money created, in effect, by the free enterprise system. It isn't all just printed in Washington. But that may sound too defensive. I think he was right in saying it was that the inflation is Washington-based.
Mr. Martin, nobody's been in the firing line longer than you, 17 years head of the Fed. Could you briefly comment on that, and we'll go around the group?
I want to say 19 years. I wouldn't be out here if it weren't for Milton Friedman today. He came down and gave us advice from time to time.
Never taken him.
He's going to do some interviewing later, I warn you.
And I'm rather glad we didn't take it all the time.
In your 19 years as chairman of the Federal Reserve, Bill, the average growth in the money supply was 3.1% per year. The inflation rate was 2.2%. Since you left, the money supply has exactly doubled. The inflation rate is averaged over 7%. And, of course, in recent times, the money supply has been growing in double-digit territory, as has our inflation rate.
May I first of all confirm two facts which have been so vividly brought out in the film of Professor Friedman, namely that at the basis of the relatively good performance of Western Germany were really two events. One, the establishment of a new sound money, which we tried to preserve sound afterwards, and secondly, the jump overnight into a free market economy without any controls over prices and wages. These were the two fundamental facts. Now, we have tried to preserve monetary stability by just trying to follow this prescription of Professor Friedman, namely monetary discipline, keeping monetary growth relatively moderate. I must, however, warn you, it's not so easy as it looks if you just say governments have to have the courage to persist in that course.
Yeah.
Nobody does disagree with the proposition that excessive growth in money supply is an essential element in the inflationary process, and that the real problem is not what to do, but how to have the courage and the will to do it. And I want to go and start, if I may, on that subject, because I think that's what we ought to explore. Why is it we haven't had the courage and don't, and under what circumstances will we? And I want to start with Bill Martin, because his experience is a very interesting experience. His 19 years was divided into different periods. In the first period, that average that Burl Sprinkle spoke about, averaged two very different periods. An early period of very slow growth and slow inflation, a later period of what at the time was regarded as creeping inflation. Now we'd be delighted to get back to it. People don't remember that at the time that Mr. Nixon introduced price and wage controls in 1971 to control an outrageous inflation, the rate of inflation was 4.5% per year. Today we'd regard that as a major achievement. But the latter part of the period when you were chairman was a period when the inflation rate was starting to creep up and money growth rate was also creeping up. Now, if I go from your period, you were eloquent in your statements to the public, to the press, to everyone about the evils of inflation and about the determination of the Federal Reserve not to be the architect of inflation. Your successor, Arthur Burns, was just as eloquent, made exactly the same kinds of statements, as effectively, and again, over and over again, said the Federal Reserve will not be the architect of inflation. His successor, Mr. G. William Miller, made the same speeches and the same statements and the same protestations. His successor, Paul Volcker, he is making the same statements. Now, my question to you is, why is it that there has been such a striking difference between the excellent pronouncements of all chairmen of the Fed? Therefore, it's not personal on you. You have a lot of company, unfortunately, for the country. Why is it that there's been such a wide diversion between the excellent pronouncements on the one hand and what I regard as a very poor performance on the other?
Because monetary policy is not the only element. Fiscal policy is equally important.
You're shifting the buck to the Treasury.
Yes.
To the Congress. We'll get to Mr. Brown.
Yeah,
don't
that's
worry.
Right. The relationship of fiscal policy to monetary policy is one of the important things.
Could you remind us, the general audience, when you say fiscal policy, what you mean in distinction to monetary policy?
Well, taxation,
Yep.
the raising revenue.
And spending.
And spending.
And deficits.
And deficits, yes, exactly. And I think that you have to realize that when I've talked for a long time about the independence of the Federal Reserve, that's independence within the government, not independence of the government. And I've worked consistently with the Treasury to try to see that the government is financed. Now this gets back to spending. The government says they're going to spend a certain amount, and then it turns out they don't spend that amount. It doubles.
The job of the Federal Reserve is not to run government spending. It's not to run government taxation. The job of the Federal Reserve is to control the money supply. And I believe, frankly, I have always believed, as you know, that these are excuses and not reasons for
well, that's where you and I differ, because I think we would be irresponsible if we didn't take into account the needs and what the government is saying and doing. I think if we just went on our own irresponsibly, I say it on this because I was in the Treasury before I came to the Fed, and I know the other side of the picture. I think we'd be rightly condemned by the American people and by the electorate.
Every central bank in this world, including the German central bank, including the Federal Reserve System, has the technical capacity to make the money supply do over a period of 2 or 3 or 4 months, not daily, but over a period, has the technical capacity to control it.
Dr.
Is that right?
I cannot explain the kind of excessive money creation that has occurred in terms of the technical incapacity of the Federal Reserve System or of the German Central Bank or the Bank of England or any other central bank in the world.
I wouldn't say technically we are incapable of doing that, although we have never succeeded in controlling the money supply month by month.
That's right.
But I would say we can technically control it half-yearly, from one half-year period to the next, and that would be sufficient for controlling inflation.
It's like steering a ship, it doesn't move.
I'm an economic scientist, and I'm trying to observe phenomena, and I observe that every Federal Reserve chairman says one thing and does another. I don't mean he does, the system does.
Yeah. How different is your setup in Germany? You've heard this problem of governments getting committed to spending and the Fed having one way or the other to accommodate itself to it. Now, what's your position on this very interesting problem?
We are very independent of the government, from the government, but on the other hand, we are an advisor of the government, also on their budget deficits. And they would not easily go before Parliament with a deficit in their budget which is openly criticized and disapproved by the central bank. Why? Because we have a tradition in our country that we can also publicly criticize the government on this account. And second, if, as has happened in our case too, the government goes beyond what is tolerable for the sake of overall equilibrium, we have let it come through in the capital markets. That is to say, they have driven up interest rates. That has drawn public criticism, and that has had some effect on their attitude.
I think that's a very important point that Dr. Eminger just made, because there is not a one-to-one relationship between government deficits and what happens to the money supply at all. The pressure on the Federal Reserve comes indirectly. It comes because large government deficits, if they are financed in the general capital market, will drive up interest rates, and then we have the Wright-Patmans in Congress and their successors pressuring the Federal Reserve to enter in and finance the deficit by printing money as a way of supposedly holding down interest rates. Now, before I turn to Mr. Brown and ask him that, I just want to make one point which is very important. The Federal Reserve's activities in trying to hold down interest rates have put us in a position where we have the highest interest rates in history. It's another example of the difference between the announced intentions of a policy and the actual result. But now I want to come to Clarence Brown and ask him, shift the buck to him and put him on the hot seat for a bit. The government spending has been going up rapidly, Republican administration or Democratic administration. This is a nonpartisan issue. It doesn't matter.